It's lovely to see you all. I am Sara Pankenier Weld, and I'm today's moderator for this event with Vladimir Kara-Murza, whom we are deeply honored and delighted to have on campus to speak with us today, and I think our audience just demonstrated that. So, as you know, Vladimir Kara-Murza is a Russian politician, writer, historian, documentary filmmaker, and former political prisoner who has been poisoned, arrested, and sentenced to 25 years at a maximum security prison in Siberia before being released in 2024 as part of the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the Cold War. He's also a contributing writer at the Washington Post, winning the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for his columns written from prison, and the recipient of several awards, among which I might mention the Human Rights Prize. In a way, the award-winning film Antidote, directed by Emmy-winning British director James Jones, picks up where the earlier and highly acclaimed Navalny film left off, also since Christo Grozev plays a role in Navalny's story, which led to the threats to Grozev's life shown in this film. As we know, opposition figure Alexei Navalny tragically died in Russian prison last year after a brazen attempt on his life and his courageous return to Russia, showing how murderous Putin's regime is. So I suggest that we take a moment to remember the late Alexei Navalny today. Vladimir Vladimirovich, we are so glad that your own harsh imprisonment had a happier end, as shown through key scenes that are highlights for me in this film, and that you regained your freedom in last year's prisoner exchange. For the rest of our conversation, I would like to ask you about your own experience and thoughts. But I wanted to begin by asking you for your thoughts about the imprisonment and death of Navalny, whom I understand you knew, as well as how we might honor his legacy, or that of your mentor, Boris Nemtsov, as in your documentary film.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for such a warm welcome and for the opportunity to be here in Santa Barbara. It's my first time in your beautiful city, and I hope to come back again many, many times in the future. I remember the day when I found out that Alexei had been murdered. I had no doubt that he had been murdered from the very beginning. It was a Friday, February the 16th, last year, 2024. I was sitting in my cell, alone as usual. I was always in solitary confinement. This was dinner time. Everything in prisons in Russia, especially in Omsk, especially in Siberia, everything has to be, by the clock. When it's dinner time, it's dinner time. You're supposed to sit and eat and do nothing else. But there was a little radio attached to the wall of my cell, and the news came on. And in my time in prison, I taught myself to sort of detach from what's on that radio. I had no control over it. It was controlled by the guards that switch it on at 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call and only turn it off again at 9 p.m. with the lights out. And every time, there was this, you can imagine what kind of things, I would listen on Russian state radio, just propaganda, some quote-unquote patriotic music, propaganda again. And so this was like, an outside noise for me almost. And suddenly I heard the name Navalny. And this was the first and last time I heard his name on state radio in Russia, because for the Putin propaganda, we do not exist. Opposition leaders are not supposed to be mentioned. And suddenly the mention came, and so I immediately gave up what I was doing, jumped up to the corner where that radio was, only to hear completely incomprehensible words, something to the tune of that collapsed after coming back from his walk, and the death was ruled by doctors after about 40 minutes or something like that. And then there was nothing. This was a Friday evening, as I mentioned. And the worst days in prison are the weekends, because there are no letters, there are no lawyers, there's nothing. You just sit there alone. And for the next 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, I'd almost convinced myself that this is not real, that I'd imagined this. Because when you sit in solitary confinement, you very soon stop understanding the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And one of the main reasons that prolonged solitary confinement by international law is considered to be a form of torture is because you start going crazy when you constantly sit alone. And so by Sunday night, I had almost convinced myself that I'd made this all up, that this didn't happen. But then my lawyer came on Monday and he told me that this was true. You mentioned the word murderers, Sarah, a few minutes ago. I think it's very important to remember that when we are talking about Vladimir Putin, we're not only talking about a dictator, we're not only talking about an illegitimate usurper, he's all of those things, but we're also talking about a murderer in the most direct and literal sense of this word. I have no doubt that it was Vladimir Putin personally who ordered the assassination of Alexei Navalny, just as it was Vladimir Putin who personally ordered the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. The two most prominent, the two most important, most effective, most visible, most powerful leaders of the democratic opposition in Russia have been murdered on Putin's personal orders. I knew Alexei Navalny for many years. He was somebody who was prepared to stand up for what he believed in, needless to say. His whole biography speaks to it. And I had the greatest honor of my life of working for more than 15 years alongside Boris Nemtsov, who had been Deputy Prime Minister of Russia in the 1990s, who had been spoken about as the most likely successor to President Yeltsin. He was the most popular politician in Russia at one point in the late 1990s. And I think moments like this really speak to the importance of personalities in history. Would it have been a completely different world if Boris Nemtsov became president of Russia, not Vladimir Putin? And, when I hear that people speak about politics as a dirty business, when people speak about politics as something cynical, something about compromise, realpolitik, and so on, I know that that's not right, because I've seen politics being done otherwise. Because Boris Nemtsov was my role model in politics. He was my mentor, he was my teacher, and he showed that it is actually possible to do politics with clean hands, to be in politics for the right reasons. He always believed, he always said what he believed, he always did what he had promised. He always chose to do what was right, not what was expedient or convenient or easy. And he always stood up for what he believed in, regardless of the price. And the price for him turned out to be the highest possible, just as it was for Alexei Navalny. You also mentioned the word commemoration. When Boris Nemtsov was killed, this was 10 years ago this year, February 2015. So Navalny, of course, was poisoned in his prison cell. As you've just seen the film about this special assassination squad that operates within the Russian government. Boris Nemtsov was gunned down, murdered, 5 bullets in the back, by an officer of the Russian Interior Ministry. It was very demonstrative. In Navalny's case, they tried to hide it. They tried to pretend there was some natural cause for his death. Nobody believes it, but that's what they say. With Boris Nemtsov, it was also a very clear message to everybody that we can do this and get away with it. We can murder the main opposition leader, literally in front of the Kremlin, because this is where Boris was killed. He was walking home on the bridge directly in front of the Kremlin. And we can get away with it. And Putin did get away with it for now. But what was really striking for a lot of us was that back then, when Boris was killed 10 years ago, the Kremlin tried to kill his memory as well. It wasn't enough for them to kill the man. They wanted to kill the name, the memory, the legacy. And so, every day, if you go to that bridge next to the Kremlin where he was killed, you would find fresh flowers on that spot and candles that would be lit, and the portraits and the icons, because people remember and people come and people pay their respects. Once in a while, Putin's police comes in. They sweep away the flowers, they throw away the candles, they arrest the volunteers who are standing, guard by that unofficial memorial. And they're making it very clear that for as long as this regime remains in power, they will not allow any commemorations for a Russian statesman in Russia. And so what we did back then, 10 years ago, friends and colleagues of Boris Nemtsov, we decided, okay, if we're not going to be allowed, again, for now, to commemorate a Russian statesman in Russia, then we're going to go and do this in free countries. And so we went around the world. We spoke and met with parliamentarians, mayors, elected officials. And I'm proud to say that as of this day, as of December 2025, 8 cities around the world have named streets, squares, or parks in honor of Boris Nemtsov. this country was the first to do this in Washington, D.C. If you go to the Russian embassy to the main gate in Georgetown, you will see a big sign that says Boris Nemtsov Plaza. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation that was led by Senator Marco Rubio, the current Secretary of State on the Republican side, and Senator Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware, on the Democratic side. It was passed unanimously by the D.C. Council, signed by the D.C. Mayor, and we held an unveiling ceremony in February of 2018, on the 3rd anniversary of Boris's assassination. And when I spoke at that ceremony, I said that, of course, I thank people who made it happen. And I said that to me, as a Russian politician, simply as a Russian citizen, I can think of nothing more pro-Russian than to name a street in front of the Russian embassy after a Russian statesman. And whatever the people in the Kremlin think of this today, and as you can imagine, they hate it, I have no doubt that the day will come when Russia is proud that our embassies and consulates and trade missions in so many cities around the world, and this now includes London, Prague, Kiev, Vilnius, and other places, that so many of our diplomatic missions are standing on streets and in squares that are named after Boris Nemtsov.
Yeah. Turning now to your own story, some dramatic parts of which are portrayed in this film, can you share anything about what you and others who were part of the prisoner exchange were experiencing as you left Russia and exchanged imprisonment for freedom?
Well, first let me say that all of us on the Russian side had absolutely no idea what was happening. The preparations for that exchange were kept secret until the very last moment. To me, this whole story began in the last week of July of last year, 2024. I was sitting in my cell in my prison in Omsk, alone as always, solitary confinement. You know, it's this tiny cell, 3 by 4 meters, that's about 10 by 13 feet. All you can really do, because your bunk gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning. You're only allowed to take it down again at 9 p.m. with the lights out. And you have nothing. There's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, there's no one to speak to. All you can really do is just to walk around in a small circle all day, you know, buried in your thoughts and memories. So that's what I was doing when suddenly the door of the cell was open and the prison security officer came in, flanked by a prison guard. And they led me out of the cell into some sort of a prison office. It was a small room, a desk, a chair, a big portrait of Vladimir Putin on the wall. And on a desk there was a blank sheet of paper, a pen, and some sort of a pre-printed template next to it. So the security officer tells me to sit down, take the pen, and write with my own hand what's written in the template. And so I sit down and I look at it, and it is a request for pardon that is addressed to Vladimir Putin, in which I was supposed to, with my own hand, admit my guilt, express my remorse for all the horrendous crimes I had supposedly committed, and ask Mr. Putin to please pardon me. When I first saw the paper, I thought this was just a prank. I started laughing, and I looked at the security officer's face, but his facial expression did not indicate that he was in the mood for a joke. And so he just said, sit down and write this. I said, are you serious? I said, I'm not writing anything like this ever. He said, why not? I said, well, first of all, because I have no guilt to admit. I'm not the criminal here. The criminals are the people in the Kremlin who are waging this war, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it. And secondly, because I do not consider Mr. Putin to be a lawful president of my country. He's a dictator, he's a usurper, he's a murderer, and I'm not going to ask him of anything. The security officer was visibly not pleased with my response. So he said, would you put that on paper? I said, that I'm very happy to put on paper. So I took the pen, I wrote it down, and I added that I very much hope to live to see the day when Vladimir Putin's put on trial for all the crimes he had committed. Signed, dated, and gave it to the officer. It led me back into my cell. I had absolutely no idea where this came from, what this was, and what the purpose of this was, and why this was happening. Now, fast forward 2 or 3 days. I was fast asleep. It was the middle of the night. Prisoners are not allowed to watch your clock. You're supposed to always feel disoriented, but this was nighttime. It was dark. I was asleep. And I was suddenly woken up by a loud, screeching metal noise of the 2 doors of my cell being burst open. And the same security officer barges in with a couple of security guards, prison guards. And so I wake up on the bunk, and he says to me, Convict Kara-Murza, you have 10 minutes to get up, get dressed, and get ready. And at that moment, I'm certain that they're going to lead me out to a nearby forest and shoot me. But instead of the forest, they drove me to an airport, on the police convoy, handcuffed, put me on a plane, a regular, normal passenger jet, and took me to Moscow. And it was a much more pleasant journey than I took the other way the previous year. The way I traveled from Moscow to Omsk is the same way, you read about in Solzhenitsyn's books, the same way prisoners have been transported in Russia, going back decades in the so-called Stolypin carriages, with stops on transit prisons along the way. It took 3 weeks for me to get from Moscow to Omsk the year before. This was just a nice, short 3-hour flight back. We arrive in Moscow. I'm taken by the local prisoner convoy from the plane and taken to Lefortovo, which is another name we read about in Solzhenitsyn's books, the notorious KGB political prison in Moscow that has once held legendary Kremlin opponents, the likes of Solzhenitsyn himself, Vladimir Bukovsky, Natan Sharansky, and many, many others. And they locked me up into a cell again, solitary confinement, no explanation. I had absolutely no idea what was happening. My thinking at this stage, of course, is they wouldn't shoot me. Why take me to Moscow for that? They could have done it there. But the only reason they would take somebody who is already convicted, who is already a prisoner, serving time elsewhere, to Lefortovo, is usually to present them with new criminal charges. So this is what I was thinking, and as I later spoke to colleagues who were on the exchange, they were thinking the same thing, because that's the only reason for us to be there. And then came the 1st of August, 2024. That morning, the deputy director of the Lefortovo prison, an FSB lieutenant colonel, walks in the cell. Security guards bring the bags that I brought from Siberia, from storage with all my stuff. And he tells me to take off my prison uniform and put on whatever civilian clothes that I had. And so I did, but the only civilian clothes that I had was my black t-shirt in which I slept, my long johns, because in Omsk it's -40 in the winter, you need to put something out, underneath when you go outside, and the rubber flip-flops that I would use to go to the prison shower. So I put it on. The guy looks visibly displeased. He looks at me and he says, "Don't you have any normal civilian clothes?" I said, "Lieutenant Colonel, I'm serving a 25-year sentence in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison in Siberia. Why would I need civilian clothes?" He had nothing to respond to that. He just waved the guards to take me outside. And just to show how incredibly long and surreal that day was, that same evening, I'll be meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, wearing that same t-shirt, those same long johns, and the same rubber flip-flops in the prison shower. Then they take me down the steps into the prison courtyard, and there's a bus parked there. Not a prison bus, a regular bus, a passenger-looking bus. And in front of it is a row of men, plain clothes, but their faces covered in black balaclava masks. And I have to say, I've seen a lot of things when I was in prison, but it was still a fairly intimidating sight to see that. These were officers of the so-called Alpha Group, the FSB Special Ops Team, the Spetsnaz of the old KGB, now the FSB. And they tell me to get up into the bus, and I did. And inside the bus, I see more men in black balaclavas. But next to each of them, I suddenly see a friendly face, a friend, a colleague, a fellow political prisoner who'd been serving time, elsewhere all over Russia. And it was at that moment that I understood, because there could only be one reason why all of us would be sitting in that bus together. So it was a very quick ride to Vnukovo, the government airport terminal. We were all led onto a Russian government-owned Tupolev 204 plane. Same arrangement on the plane, a masked FSB officer next to a prisoner. About a 3.5-hour flight again down to Ankara, the capital of Turkey. And once the plane got there, it was taxied off to some sort of a secluded military wing. And there were many, many other planes there. As we now know, there were, the prisoners that Putin was getting in exchange for us came from different countries. 8 countries in total were involved in preparing this exchange, including, of course, the United States. And there were some hackers and agents that were serving time in US prisons. But the main guy Putin was getting back was the FSB assassin who was serving time in Germany, whom you saw mentioned in that film. The exchange was very quick, less than an hour. We were taken onto one bus. The prisoners Putin was getting were taken into another bus. All the identities were checked. Then his guys started walking up the steps to the same plane that brought us. And then our bus sped away into some sort of a government reception area. I guess it's a hall used for hosting official delegations or state visits or something. There's a big room, very ornate, a massive long table, with sandwiches and coffee and tea laden on it and whatever else. And we were just standing there feeling totally surreal. You know, that same morning, I was still certain I was going to die in a Russian prison. And there I was, you know, standing in this reception terminal in Turkey, just when I thought things could not get any more crazy or any more surreal. A lady walked up to me, wearing a business suit. She was holding a mobile phone. She came up and she asked, "Are you Mr. Kara-Murza?" I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "I'm with the American Embassy in Ankara." And she handed me the phone and said, "The President of the United States is on the line waiting to speak with you." And at that moment, I just thought that I'm going to completely try to give up, trying to understand what is happening here. And I take the phone. I hear President Biden's voice. I try to put something together to thank him, because, of course, by this stage, we're already being told who was behind this exchange. I was, as I mentioned, 8 countries, but without Biden and Scholz, this would not have happened. They were the 2 actors in this. And so I try to put something together to say to him. Of course, I hadn't used a word of spoken English in 2.5 years. I hadn't used much Russian either, because I was in solitary confinement all the time. But I put something together to say to him, to thank him. And then he passed the phone to my wife and children who were with him in the Oval Office. Now, when I was in prison, I was not allowed to speak to my family. This is an old Soviet tradition, where the regime seeks to punish not just the political opponent, but the family too. This goes back all the way to Stalin's time. It wasn't like this in the Tsarist Empire, but it was like this from the earliest years of the Soviet regime. So I was not allowed to speak to them by phone. And, you know, suddenly I heard their voices on this mobile phone handed to me by this American diplomat from Ankara. And, you know, standing in that reception area of the Turkish government airport, hearing the voices of my wife and children on the phone, I don't think I'll be able to find words in any language that I speak to express what I felt like.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So as many of us here know, there is an unfortunately long history of imprisoned Russian intellectuals who have offered hard-earned wisdom and insight from their own experience of imprisonment, like Fyodor Dostoevsky and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Are there any insights and wisdom that you might share from your own experience of imprisonment, or from facing life-threatening experiences for that matter?
So first on Dostoevsky, the first book I read when I was transferred to my prison in Omsk was Letters from the House of the Dead. I believe that's the correct English translation, right? And that, of course, is based on his experiences in prison in Omsk, in the very same city where I was. Omsk has a long and, as you rightly said, very unfortunate tradition of holding political opponents of the Russian and then Soviet regime, going all the way back to the Decembrists. There were some of the participants in the 1825 Decembrist uprising who were in prison in Omsk. Then, of course, Dostoevsky in the 1840s and 50s. Then going into modern times, Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent time at the transit prison in Omsk. He writes about it in the Gulag Archipelago. Later on in the 70s, Mustafa Dzhemilev, the leader of the Crimean Tatar national movement, was in prison there. And so I was in good company, at least. That was the only comforting thought about it all. But, you know, one of the most shocking and striking things to me, I don't even know how to describe it. You know, it's said sometimes that it is the subconscious dream of every historian to personally experience the subject of his study. I guess be careful what you dream of, because one of my subjects of study has been the Soviet dissident movement. And I had the great honor of knowing many of these people personally, and Vladimir Bukovsky, and Yelena Bonner, Yuri Orlov, Natan Sharansky, and many, many others. Sharansky, we actually corresponded with him in prison. He was one of the former Lefortovo detainees too. But when I was rereading the books, the memoirs by Soviet dissidents in prison, I'd read them many times before, but it's a totally different sensation when you are reading the book and simultaneously living inside it. Because it was absolutely mind-boggling to me how much everything in the Russian Gulag system has remained exactly the same, down to the smallest details, the way prison guards speak with you, the way your cell is fitted, the way the prison day is structured. Everything is exactly the same as how Bukovsky describes it when he was there in the 1960s. And there's a very big and very important lesson in that for me. And it's just another very striking reminder of the mistake that was made by Russia's democratic leaders in the 1990s after the collapse of the communist regime, when Russia never really went through the process of transitional justice that is so important when a country transitions from a dictatorship to a democracy. You need this process of a public reckoning, a public reflection, a public accountability for all the crimes that are being committed before. If we look at the example of any country that has successfully made that journey, South Africa after apartheid, Argentina after its military junta, countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, the Baltic states after the collapse of communism and so on. Of course, Germany after 45 and then again in the eastern parts after 1989. Every one of these countries went through these processes in their different shapes and forms, but the central tenets were always the same: transparency and accountability. All the archival documents detailing the crimes by these past regimes were opened up and made public. People responsible for these crimes were brought to account. State security structures that had been perpetrating these crimes were totally disbanded. And the practices and ideologies of these old regimes were officially and publicly condemned on the level of both state and society. And this is an absolutely essential step to go through if you want to make democratic change irreversible. Russia never really had that in the 1990s. There were no openings of the archives, there were no trials, there were no truth and reconciliation commissions. The KGB was only renamed and not disbanded, and so on. And when people like, for example, Vladimir Bukovsky, was a legendary Soviet dissident, longtime prisoner of conscience, who spent 12 years in total in the Soviet Gulag, he spent all of 1992 running around every senior government office in Moscow, trying to convince President Yeltsin's officials that they needed to do all this. They needed to do all this to defend the young democracy in Russia, to make sure that the past never comes back. And all he would hear in response was, "We're not going to do this. What you're advocating for, what you're calling for, is going to be a witch hunt," they said to him. And so he looked back at them and said, "Well, in that case, the witches will come back and start hunting us." And this is exactly what happened when a Soviet KGB officer by the name of Vladimir Putin became president. Because if evil is not publicly reflected on, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it is going to come back. And this is what we saw in Russia in the 90s. And this is what we cannot allow to repeat again after the Putin regime is gone. So this is the main lesson to me, that process, that necessary stage of transitional justice that Russia never really had in the 90s, we will need to go through that after Putin to make sure that our kids and grandkids don't need to be dealing with another dictator 20 or 30 years down the line.
Yeah, thank you. Reckoning with history as a historian. I also wanted to ask, what made you go back to Russia despite the attempts on your life?
Well, first of all, I didn't go back. I never left. And it was always a question of principle for me. And the most I left was after the first poisoning. No, after the second, actually. The first poisoning, my wife took me actually here to the U.S. for medical rehabilitation. As soon as I was able to walk again, I took the first plane and returned. And after the second poisoning in 2017, she made me promise that I'll take more time to fully, recover and rehabilitate, which actually really good advice, and it helped me survive in prison better than I otherwise would have. So after the second poisoning, I spent more than a year outside of Russia. This was the longest I'd ever been outside of Russia in my whole life, I guess, except now, because since it's now been more since the prisoner exchange. But it has always been a question of principle for me that a Russian politician must be in Russia. I mean, what right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up and fight the Putin dictatorship if I was too scared to do it myself? I mean, I've always believed, and this again was the example of Boris Nemtsov, I always believed that a politician can only lead by personal example. There's no other way. Anything else is hypocrisy. The main instrument by which Vladimir Putin has been ruling over Russia for the past almost 26 years now is fear. His regime tries to make fear omnipresent, all-permeating. They want to make everyone afraid of him. And to me, one of the most important lessons of the Soviet dissident movement was that fear, at the end of the day, is always a personal choice. Yes, the regime will seek to instill fear. The regime will seek to rule by fear, to make fear omnipresent. But at the end of the day, it is up to each individual person to decide whether or not to be afraid. And Soviet dissidents showed us that it is possible to not be afraid in the worst possible circumstances. As Bukovsky once said, and I never forget these words for as long as I live, when people are starting to be afraid again, you have to come, stand next to them and say, here I am. I'm not afraid. You can only do this by personal example. And so when a full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, this was February 2022, that same week, Putin shut down what remained of independent media in Russia. There wasn't much left by then, but everything that was left was destroyed. And they passed these laws, rubber-stamped them in one day, that made it a criminal offense to not only to speak out against the war, but to even present facts about it, to even call it a war. This is really George Orwell come true. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Literally, this is the reality of Putin's Russia. And the goal of this was a very deliberate strategy by the Kremlin to make everybody afraid and terrified. And yes, a lot of people succumbed to that. A lot of people did leave. But for many of us in the Russian opposition movement, including Ilya Yashin, who was on that same prisoner exchange as I was last year, including Oleg Orlov, the head of Memorial, human rights organization, who was also on that same prisoner exchange last year, including me, including many others, it was a question of principle. Just stay. Because, you know what, even if I was powerless to stop all this fear spreading around me, at least I was not going to allow for this fear to be permeated through me. Because when people are starting to be afraid, you have to come, stand next to them and say, here I am. I'm not afraid. And this is important. This is what the Soviet dissidents showed. And this lesson remains as relevant today as it was 50 years ago.
Thank you. Since you are a historian, and since I saw you speak at your alma mater, the University of Cambridge, earlier this year, I can't resist asking you about the subject of your talk event, Russia's potential democratic path 120 years ago. How close did Russia come to democracy in the past?
Very close and many times. The crossroads that you're referring to, 1906, the first Russian parliament, was only one of them. To me, the most striking, probably, and probably the time when Russia came the closest. So Russia was the last great European power to get a parliament. This was after the revolution in 1905, when Nicholas II, the emperor, had no choice but to give concessions after the country was paralyzed by a nationwide political strike. And he signed a law on the 17th of October 1905 called the October Manifesto, which established the rule that no legislation could henceforth be adopted without the approval of elected representatives. This is the definition of a constitutional monarchy, when a monarch can no longer legislate on his or her own, when he or she has to listen to members of parliament. And so the election was held in 1906, the early months, the winter and the spring. And the result of that election was an overwhelming victory by the main pro-democracy party, the main liberal party in Russia at the time, called the Cadets, the Constitutional Democrat Party. They defeated not only the supporters of absolute monarchy, but also the sort of the radical leftists who were opposing it from the other side. And their idea was to take Russia down the path that so many other European monarchies had traveled already. Countries like Britain or Belgium or Scandinavian countries that kept the monarchy as sort of just a figurehead, just a symbol. But in reality, transitioned to full parliamentary rule. And today, if you look at the map of Europe today, about a third of European countries still have monarchies. Of course, in practice, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a beautiful symbol, where in fact, it's the elected parliament that makes all the decisions. This was the idea for Russia in 1906. And not only did the Constitutional Democrats have the practical ability to do this, having gained an overwhelming majority in that first Russian parliament, but they also had important allies within the Tsar's closest entourage. And throughout the late spring and early summer of 1906, there were actually secret talks going on between the leaders of the Constitutional Democratic Party and senior officials from the royal palace about making this historic compromise happen. for the emperor to remain a figurehead, to appoint a government that would have the confidence of the parliamentary majority and essentially put Russia firmly on the rails to a parliamentary system. I know, there's sort of the stereotype that there are no ifs in history, but I do think it is actually the responsibility of historians to analyze the potential crossroads, the forks on the road, when things could have turned into a different direction. And to me, that particular crossroads in 1906 in many ways determined our tragic and bloody 20th century, because had Russia chosen that path of a British-style parliamentary constitutional monarchy in 1906, none of the tragedies that we know have happened since then would have taken place. But again, to talk about the role of personality in history, the most negative role in that episode was played by Pyotr Stolypin, who was then the interior minister, later became the prime minister, somebody who's glorified by the current propaganda in Vladimir Putin's Russia, you wouldn't be surprised to hear. But he derailed this compromise literally at the very last moment. Literally, the leaders of the cadet party were sitting there dressed in their tailcoats, waiting for the phone call from the imperial palace to go and kiss hands, as the British say, when the king, or the emperor in our case, formally gives a mandate to form a government. Stolypin broke it off, partly for ideological reasons. He was a committed opponent of democracy, of parliamentarism for Russia, partly for personal reasons, because he became prime minister as a result of the dissolution of the first Russian parliament that happened in July of 1906. But for our country, it was a tragedy that determined much of what would happen later on. There are many such crossroads in our history. And it's just, if you look at how close on so many occasions Russia came to, taking that turn to being a normal, civilized, democratic country. And all these questions that are just hanging there in the air. In 1881, what would have happened if Alexander II took a different route, returning to the Winter Palace, not the one where he was blown up by a terrorist? Because that morning he had approved the draft constitution and the first step towards creating a parliament in Russia 30 years before it was actually created. What would have happened if the provisional government in Russia in 1917 did not decide to postpone the election to the Constituent Assembly by just 2 months, from September to November, because they felt that the electoral law was not perfect enough. They wanted to make it even more perfect. They had this whole special commission of lawyers working, including Vladimir Nabokov Sr., working to make this electoral law the best in Europe, the best in the world. And it was. It was the most democratic electoral law in Europe at the time, in terms of voting rights for women, in terms of no sort of disparities based on your income or anything. It was, full, equal, direct, universal suffrage. Except it was 2 months too late, because in October the Bolsheviks seized power in a coup d'etat, and the subsequent election became meaningless. There were so many of these crossroads that Russia passed and took the wrong turn, pre-programming so many tragedies that would happen later. I know that one time, we will take the right turn on that road. But for that, we need to be ready. For that, we need to be prepared. And for that, we need to draw the lessons and learn from the mistakes that were committed in the past. And that's why I think it's so important to have conversations like this.
Yeah. So in your closing speech at your trial, you said, "I know that the day will come when the darkness over our country will dissipate, and then our people will open their eyes and shudder at the sight of the horrific crimes committed in their names." Do you have any wisdom to offer people worldwide about democracy in such moments?
I wouldn't presume to give anybody any advice, but what I meant in that closing statement was precisely what we were just discussing with you a few minutes ago, that Russia never went through that process of a public reckoning with all the crimes that had been committed against it, but also in its name by the communist regime over so many decades. And this led us to where we are today. And it's led the world to where it is today as well, because what happens in Russia affects everyone, as I think everybody's been able to see in the worst possible way these last 3.5, almost 4 years. Next time Russia gets this window of opportunity for democratic change, for democratic transition, we have to get it right. There will have to be a real accountability for all the crimes that the Putin regime has committed, is still committing every single day against the people of Ukraine, against the people of Georgia, against the people of Syria. He has meddled everywhere, there's the people of Venezuela where he helped suppress a popular uprising against the rigged election last year. And also they'll have to be held accountable for all the crimes they have committed against our own people in Russia. The murder of Boris Nemtsov, the murder of Alexei Navalny, with which we began this conversation today, the persecution over the years of thousands upon thousands of our own Russian citizens simply for speaking the truth and for opposing this regime. These people will need to be held to account, because otherwise we will never get out of this vicious cycle. And otherwise the next generation will have to deal with another small p Putin down the line. We have to make sure next time we get it right. And yes, a part of this is not just about personal accountability for the criminals, including war criminals, but this is also a process of reflection for the whole society, that the whole society will need to go through, like Germans had to go through after 1945. Like, those people who held up the apartheid regime in South Africa had to go through after 1994, and so on. Because one of the biggest factors of strength for any dictatorship is public indifference, when a lot of people choose to look the other way. A lot of people choose to detach themselves from politics. That's sort of the fashionable way of putting it. I don't like politics, it's a dirty business, blah, blah, blah. But the result of that is that these dictatorships, these regimes, feel free to do whatever they want. And so I think it's very important, not just for the specific criminals, but also for our society as a whole, to go through that process of a public reckoning, to see, to realize, to comprehend what was being committed in its name, because that's what Putin is claiming, that he commits this, in the name of the whole of Russia, supposedly. Obviously that's a lie, because there are millions of people in Russia who oppose all of this. But there are also millions who are staying silent. And I think it is important to go through that process to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
Thank you. And as a kind of closing question, so you spoke out against Russia's war on Ukraine, and you've spoken out against Vladimir Putin. And the film Antidote, as well as Russia's history and your own experience, show the potential costs of speaking truth to power. Is there a final message you'd like to offer us about, based on your own knowledge, values, or experience, about speaking out for truth and justice, no matter the cost or stakes?
I think the best way this was expressed was said many years ago by Andrei Sakharov, the great Russian scientist, physicist, dissident, humanist, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, of course, who said, and one of the leaders of the Soviet dissident movement, he said that at the end of the day, the most moral choice also becomes the most pragmatic, meaning that I think human history has proven beyond any doubt that it is only when people stand at what is right, not when they choose to bow, to the surrounding circumstances, not when they choose to go along with the flow, not when they choose to stay silent in the face of obvious evil and oppression. It's only when people choose to do what is right that they actually move history forward and that they get us to someplace good. And I think that's a lesson that's been proven so many times by so many different countries that it should really be accepted as an axiom by this stage in the year 2025.
Thank you. And now Vladimir Kara-Murza has graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience.
Vladimir, thank you so much for your heroic conduct throughout this whole story. I wanted to ask a question: if we are really had a choice in the 90s, like this crossroads, because Yeltsin, he quickly blew up the democracy in '93 when he shut the parliament, and then he himself installed Putin in power just to make sure his family is going to be protected. So he himself was never a big proponent of democracy, and he blew up the Soviet Union just to usurp power inside one of its biggest regions, which was Russia. So do you really think there was a choice, or it was predestined because it was just sort of a nomenclatura coup?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I can't resist a small correction of terms. Yeltsin certainly did not usurp power. He's the first democratically elected leader in a 1,000-year history of Russia. In June 1991, the first ever direct election for head of state, he was the opposition candidate, and he defeated the candidate of the then ruling Communist Party of the Soviet Union by 57% to 17%. The people have spoken very clearly, so he did not usurp power. He was the people's choice, no question about it. But of course, a big part of the problem is exactly what you're talking about. He was, after all, somebody who came from the old system too. He was a regional secretary of the Communist Party in Sverdlovsk, a member of the Central Committee and so on, and that was a big part of the reason that lustrations, for example, were not really introduced in Russia in the early 1990s, right? Lustrations being these legal procedures that would bar members of the old regimes from ever again holding positions of power, something that did happen in countries like Poland and Czech Republic and the Baltic states. But, and I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this particular topic, read the book by Vladimir Bukovsky that's called Judgment in Moscow. In Russian, it's Moskovsky Proces, and it's in both Russian and in English. You can find it easily on Amazon and eBay and so on. And it's a book about precisely those few crucial months in late 1991, early 1992, when what you're talking about was possible. Because, you know, the totalitarian system had just spectacularly crashed down, literally in a matter of days. The nomenclatura was disoriented, it was scared. You know, when the crowds were taking down the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky in Moscow in August 1991, you could see these KGB officers hiding behind the curtains in the building. They were afraid that people are going to storm the building and just get them out of there. And that was a moment, as Bukovsky writes, that was a moment when everything was possible. This is a quote. I also have to say that this moment was very short. It was only those few months in late 1991, in early 1992, when some of the Central Committee archives were partially opened, during the hearing in the Constitutional Court on the Communist Party in 1992. It was a pale shadow of what could have been a real Nuremberg-style trial, but nevertheless, it started happening. That same year, 1992, Galina Starovoitova, a member of parliament from St. Petersburg, one of the leaders of the Democratic Russia movement, introduced into the Russian parliament a draft law on lustrations that had been modeled on a similar law already passed in Czechoslovakia by that point. A law that would have prevented former senior officials of the Communist Party and former senior officers of the KGB from holding positions of executive authority. Had that law been passed, Vladimir Putin would not even been able to become deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, let alone prime minister or president of Russia. That same year, 1992, Anatoly Kononov, a judge of the Russian Constitutional Court, published a landmark legal opinion, which you can also find. It's publicly available now online in the archival materials, in which he made a forceful legal case for organizing a full-scale trial for all the crimes committed by the Soviet communist regime using existing international statutes to which the Soviet Union was a party. We're not talking about retroactive application of the law. We're talking about a very legal process. Statutes such as those relating to genocide, to war crimes, to crimes against peace and humanity, and so on. So to answer your question, this was possible. But post-Soviet inertia proved stronger than the desire for real renewal. And as I already mentioned in our previous conversation, many of these officials in Yeltsin's government was telling Bukovsky, no, this is too radical, it's going to be a witch hunt. And in the end, Kononov's legal opinion was not moved on. And in the end, Starovoitova's law on lustration was never considered. And in the end, their archives that were partly opened for that Constitutional Court case were shut down again by the end of 1992. And yes, part of the reason was the fact that so many of the top leaders of Russia at the time were holdovers from the Soviet era, including President Yeltsin himself. But another big and very important part of the reason, of which Bukovsky also speaks, was that Western leaders, the leaders of Western democracies, were putting immense pressure on the Yeltsin government not to open the archives, because they knew that there'd be many interesting things about them in those archives as well. Because for many years, for many decades, Western politicians, Western leaders cooperated with the Soviet regime, very often not publicly, and they knew that those documents would be there, and they did not want them come out into the light of day. I think there's a very important lesson in that. First is that this window of opportunity, by definition, is very short and very brief. It will be, again, exactly the same after Putin is gone. It will be very short, very brief, a few months at best. We will not have the luxury of years to sit there and figure out what do we do now. But secondly, those so-called arguments that were put forward against what Bukovsky and Starovoytov and Kononov were proposing back in the 1990s, these arguments, so-called arguments, should not fly anymore. Because we know what happens when they prevail. We are living through it now. And so the next time that window of opportunity opens up, it will be swift and sudden, by the way, as it always is in Russian history. Both the Tsarist regime in 1917 and the communist regime in 1991 collapsed in 3 days, literally speaking, and nobody saw it coming. The next time will be exactly the same. None of us will know even a week beforehand. But we need to be ready for that moment. And we need to be ready to make sure that we do not squander the opportunity the way it was squandered back in the 1990s. And part of that process will absolutely have to involve a full opening, full declassification of the archives. And whatever Western leaders, including your leaders, say about it now, no, we're not going to listen to them anymore. And all that information will come out. I think there'll be a lot of interesting stuff that all of us will find in there while those archives are published. Thank you so much for your question. First of all, I'm not sure we can still use the term opposition when we talk about Russia, right? Because to me, the very word opposition belongs to democracies, to normal countries, to free societies, right? Because members of the opposition should sit in legislatures and debate in television studios and run in elections and so on. In our country, yours and mine, people who oppose the regime are either killed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. So perhaps the word resistance or the word dissidence, again, as back in the 60s and 70s, would be more appropriate. But to the substance of your question, no, of course, in a dictatorial regime, it's not possible to speak of any real opposition structures. I mean, there's one last opposition party that remains in Russia, Yabloko, the last party that's against the war, and they're under incredible pressure. 3 of their deputy leaders are under criminal prosecution, including one very good friend of mine, Maxim Kruglov, who is under arrest in Moscow's Butyrka prison for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. 8 of their regional leaders are in prison. Dozens of their members have been charged either criminally or administratively with anti-war speech and so on. So nobody believes that in the so-called parliamentary election next year in 2026, they'll be able to participate. So this is sort of, I would put this on the one side, the structures, the opposition sort of infrastructure that is not possible in a totalitarian regime, needless to say. But what is much more important than that to me is that we know that there are many people, millions of people in Russia who fundamentally reject what is happening now, who fundamentally reject Putin, who fundamentally reject his kleptocratic and murderous regime, who fundamentally reject the war of aggression against Ukraine, who want Russia to become, in the words of Alexei Navalny, a normal European country. Do you remember that interview you gave to Echo of Moscow many years ago? And a journalist asked him, what's your goal for Russia? What's your program? If you come to power, what do you want Russia to be? And I guess the journalist was expecting a long, detailed, drawn-out response. And Alexei just said that one phrase. He said, we want Russia to be a normal European country, full stop. And everything is in that one phrase. We know there are millions of people in Russia who believe in that vision. And sometimes it is out of the darkest tragedy that comes hope. And we saw that again last year when Alexei Navalny was murdered, because on the day of his funeral in Moscow, there were tens of thousands of people on the streets, all around the church. The church itself was blocked off where the funeral service was held. Only the closest family were allowed in. But all around the church there were tens of thousands of people, mostly young people, your age or younger, who many of them were saying goodbye to their families that morning because they did not know whether or not they would come back home that night. Because they knew that there would be FSB operatives, there would be police agents, there would be video cameras. Every name would be taken, every face would be registered and so on. And yet they still came. Tens of thousands of people shouting, no to war, Russia without Putin, and Russia will be free, on the streets of Moscow in 2024. When I see this, it fills me with hope. When I see the hours-long lines for Boris Nadezhdin, the only anti-war candidate in last year's so-called presidential election, people all over the country, thousands of people standing in the Russian winter outside of his campaign offices to sign the ballot petitions to get him registered as a candidate, to say what they think of this war. When I see this, it fills me with hope. A couple of weeks ago, no, more than that, a month ago, members of a musical group called Stop Time were arrested in St. Petersburg for performing anti-war songs on the streets. They'd hold these spontaneous concerts, literally on the streets and the crossroads, and every time they would sing, there'd be dozens, sometimes hundreds of people gathering around them and joining in the singing. They were arrested in mid-October, subjected to a series of so-called carousel arrests. So you get one administrative arrest after the other. And at one point, when they were taken to one more of these court hearings, in the paddy wagon, the lead guitarist of the music group, called Alexander Orlov, proposed to the lead singer, Diana Loginova. He actually made her a ring out of a paper napkin. He rolled it in and then proposed to her, and she accepted. And it was sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by these fully armed policemen in black masks. Everything was supposed to intimidate them, but they were sitting there, they were laughing and they were smiling. You know, free people in an unfree country. And I look at them. You know, Alexander's 22 years old. Diana is 18. She's younger than my older daughter is. They are the future of Russia. And a septuagenarian dictator in the Kremlin is not.
I'm very sympathetic and appreciative and have deep respect for those Russians who are in opposition. You mentioned those who stay silent, but there are Russians killing Ukrainians daily. And I want to know, why are they killing Ukrainians? These are people, many of them, who are have relatives in Ukraine, mixed marriages of Russians and Ukrainians. There are people in Russia who are fully in support of Putin's plans against Ukraine. What is their motivation? Why are they doing that? How do you explain it?
Okay, thank you for that question. And you're absolutely right. There are many people, including, I think, at least tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who are actually responsible for war crimes. And when I speak about the need for accountability after this regime is gone, I'm not only speaking about, Putin, the closest entourage. I mean down to the last private. Everyone who's responsible for war crimes will have to be held accountable. As for why, different reasons. First of all, of course, do not discount a quarter century of propaganda by Putin's regime. The first thing Putin did when he came to power, 26 years ago, and first of all, just think of this number. I have to remind myself sometimes that somebody who's even a little younger than me has no memories of free elections, independent media, political pluralism in Russia. All they know is Putin. Now, my oldest daughter is 19. Her generation, all their lives have been spent in Russia with this regime. We have people in Russia who were born, went to kindergarten, went to school, went to university, graduated, got married, had children, got a job. Many now died in the war in Ukraine, all this time while this one guy has been in power. Just think of this. You've had, I think, 5 presidents in this country while he was there. And one of the first things he did back in the early 2000s was he shut off independent television networks, making sure that his government had a full monopoly on information that was reaching millions of people around Russia. So, of course, 25 years of brainwashing works. However, sorry I am to say that, it does. Not just in Russia. Look at any other dictatorship. Brainwashing, propaganda, and censorship works. And yes, there are people who believe all this nonsense about, the Western conspiracies and whatever else. I mean, I'm not going to recite, full well what comes out of the Kremlin. There are people who believe this. There are others who are doing this for purely economic reasons. It is not a coincidence that some of the poorer regions of Russia, especially out in Siberia and the Far East and the Caucasus, have seen disproportionately high numbers of mobilizations compared to, let's say, Moscow and St. Petersburg, where it's almost non-existent. Because in those regions, and this is, by the way, this is in no way to justify, nothing justifies going to war and killing innocent people in a sovereign country and committing war crimes. Nothing justifies it. But as a form of explanation, in those poor regions where people have no prospects, no economic base, no alternatives, no social lifts, nothing, when the Russian defense ministry comes in and say, we're going to pay you this amount of money, and if you get killed, we're going to pay this to your family, well, I guess some people accept that and go for it. Then I guess there are some people in any society who are just fundamentally bad people, who are sadists, who like to go and kill somebody. Any country has people like this, and there's nothing uniquely Russian about it. But it is a very big problem, and it is a problem that is going to haunt us for many years after Putin is gone. Because all of these people who are now there will at some point come back. With all their PTSD, with all the experiences, with all these horrendous killings that they went through. Remember we all remember the big crime wave in the 90s that was to a large extent the result of former Soviet soldiers who were in the Afghanistan war in the 80s, who came back with all of their PTSD, with all the experiences, and who, many of them joined all these gangs and mafia organizations and so on. And then they were also joined up by people who went through the Chechen wars in the 1990s. They also joined in that wave. Well, those numbers were nothing compared to the numbers of people who are now involved in the war in Ukraine. Up to 1 million people, nobody knows for sure, right, because these figures are classified. But according to international estimates, including in the recent UN human rights report on Russia, up to 1 million people, that's going to be a major problem. But this is why it makes it all the more important to have this accountability, to have this transitional justice for real, not just symbolic, for real. And earlier this year in the summer, I was in Strasbourg for what I think was a historic event. I don't use that word lightly, but I think it was. When the Council of Europe, which is the largest and oldest pan-European organization, set up a special international tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. It's going to be based in The Hague, and that's going to have jurisdiction to investigate, prosecute, and try people for what is going on. More than 50 countries are now joined up, including most European countries and Canada. Unfortunately, the US is not, perhaps not surprisingly in the current situation. But I remember we were sitting and talking during that meeting. This was the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe summer session. I was speaking with Ukrainian colleagues, and they asked me, why I was there. And I said, well, because this is just as important for us as it is for you, to have this justice, to have this accountability. Because Russia is not going to have a normal, peaceful, democratic future unless all of these criminals, again, every single one, from Putin down to the last soldier, are held accountable for everything they have been doing and everything they still continue to do today.
So to conclude, I would like to thank you so much, Vladimir Kara-Murza, for honoring us with your august presence today and sharing your moving, powerful, insightful, and surprisingly uplifting insights and thoughts. And I'm sure I speak for all of us when I wish you and Russia and all the world success in achieving a day when, to quote your own words, the darkness over our country will be gone and a better, more just, and more democratic future can be realized.
A normal European country, as Alexei Navalny has said. That day will come. Thank you so much. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.